In the summer of 1930, a 60-year-old man in a white cotton robe walked 240 miles across western India in 24 days. He walked in the heat through dust past villages where farmers stopped their work to watch him pass. By the time he reached the sea, thousands of people were walking beside him. When he arrived at the beach at Dandi on the morning of April 6th, he bent down, picked up a small lump of dried salt from the sand, and held it up. That act, one elderly man picking up a handful of mud from a beach, brought the British Empire to a crisis it had not anticipated and set in motion the chain of events that would end 300 years of colonial rule over the most populous territory on Earth. The man was Mohandas Gandhi. The act was illegal. Producing salt without paying the British salt tax was a criminal offense under colonial law. And Gandhi chose it specifically deliberately above every other possible act of civil disobedience available to him, because he understood something about salt that the British had spent 3 centuries exploiting and that most people in the modern world have entirely forgotten. Salt is not a seasoning, it is not a condiment, it is not a minor ingredient that makes food taste better. Salt is, in the most literal biological sense, a requirement for human life. Without sodium chloride, the human nervous system cannot transmit signals, the muscles cannot contract, the blood cannot maintain its volume, the kidneys cannot regulate fluid balance, the body cannot survive. Every human being on Earth requires a continuous dietary supply of salt, and for most of human history in most parts of the world, obtaining that supply was not trivial. That biological necessity, the absolute, non-negotiable, inescapable requirement of every human body for a mineral that is unevenly distributed across the Earth's surface, is the foundation of one of the longest, bloodiest, most consequential economic and political stories in the history of civilization. It is the story of how a white crystal became an instrument of empire, a cause of wars, a currency of labor, a tool of taxation, and finally, in Gandhi's hands on a beach in Gujarat, a weapon of revolution. And it begins not with empires or armies but with fish. Specifically, with the problem of what to do with fish when you are nowhere near a place that is cold enough to keep them from rotting. The earliest documented use of salt as a preservative dates to roughly 6000 BCE in the region around Lake Yuncheng in northern China, where people were harvesting salt crystals from the lake's surface and using them to preserve food. But salt preservation is almost certainly older than that, older than writing, older than agriculture in some regions, possibly as old as the human understanding that certain mineral deposits could change the behavior of flesh and keep it edible far longer than it would otherwise remain so. The chemistry of salt preservation is simple and brutal. Salt draws moisture out of biological tissue through osmosis. Bacteria and molds require moisture to grow. Remove the moisture and you remove the conditions that allow spoilage. A fish packed in salt will remain edible for months or years. A fish left in the open air will be dangerous to eat within hours in warm weather. The difference between those two outcomes, between food that can be stored and transported and traded across long distances and food that must be consumed immediately near where it was caught, is the difference between civilizations that can develop complex trade networks and civilizations that cannot. This is not a small distinction. The ability to preserve food is one of the foundational technologies of complex civilization, and salt was, for most of human history, the primary means by which food was preserved. Before refrigeration, before canning, before the industrial food processing that now allows a chicken raised in Arkansas to be sold in a supermarket in London 3 weeks later, salt was the technology that made it possible to store the surplus production of good harvests and good fishing seasons against the inevitable bad ones. Salt was the technology that made it possible to feed armies on campaign, to provision ships on long voyages, to supply cities that could not grow their own food. Salt was, in a very real sense, the technology that made the ancient and medieval world's most complex political and economic structures possible. Which is why the people who controlled salt could control everything else. Ancient China understood this earlier and more completely than any other civilization, and the institutions that Chinese rulers built around salt control became the template for revenue extraction that governments around the world would copy for the next 3,000 years. The first Chinese salt monopoly was established during the reign of Duke Huan of Qi in the 7th century BCE, based on the administra. Tive theories of his minister Guanzhong. Guanzhong's insight was elegant and ruthless. Taxing grain or livestock or trade goods was politically difficult because the people being taxed could see the tax and resent it directly. But everyone needed salt. Salt consumption was so universal and so non-discretionary that a tax embedded in the price of salt was, in effect, a universal poll tax that no one could avoid and no one could refuse. The salt tax was invisible in the sense that it was just the price of salt, and everyone paid it without the political friction that direct taxation generated. The revenue it produced was enormous. The salt monopoly funded the armies that defended and expanded the Chinese state. It funded the construction of the infrastructure, the canals, the roads, the granaries that made the Chinese economy function. It funded the imperial court in all its splendor. And it created, alongside the legitimate salt trade, one of the most persistent and violent criminal enterprises in Chinese history: salt smuggling. Because the salt monopoly, by design, kept the official price of salt artificially high, the incentive to smuggle salt, to buy it cheap where it was produced and sell it cheap in markets where the official price was inflated, was always present. Salt smuggling in China was not an occasional petty crime. It was a massive, organized, violent industry that the imperial government fought continuously for 2,000 years with varying degrees of success. Some of the most significant rebellions in Chinese history were led by salt smugglers. Huang Kao, whose rebellion devastated the Tang dynasty in the 9th century CE and killed millions of people, began his career as a salt smuggler. The profits from illegal salt trading provided the capital that funded insurrection. The networks built to distribute contraband salt became the organizational infrastructure of revolution. The Chinese salt monopoly lasted, with modifications and interruptions, from the 7th century BCE until 2017, when the Chinese government finally abolished it. 2,600 years. The oldest continuously operating government monopoly in the history of the world, built on the biological necessity of human beings to consume a specific mineral. On the other side of the world, in a completely different civilization with no contact with China, the Romans were arriving at identical conclusions about salt and power. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, meaning salt ration. Roman soldiers were paid partly in salt, or in some versions of the history in money specifically designated for the purchase of salt. The etymology is contested, but the underlying reality is not. Salt was valuable enough and central enough to the functioning of an army on campaign that it entered the Latin language as a synonym for compensation. When we say someone is worth their salt, we are using a phrase that traces directly back to the Roman military's dependence on the mineral. Rome's relationship with salt began, according to Roman tradition, with the founding of the city itself. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the earliest and most important roads in the Roman road network, running from Rome northeast to the salt flats of the Adriatic coast. The road predates Roman imperial expansion. It predates, quite possibly, the city of Rome itself. It was built to carry salt from the coast to the interior, and the settlement that would become Rome grew up in part because it occupied a strategically important position on that road, a natural crossing of the Tiber River where the salt trade had to pass. As Rome expanded, the control of salt production became an instrument of conquest. Roman armies advancing into new territories would often seize salt production facilities early in their campaigns, recognizing that control of salt supplies was control of the food preservation capacity of the population, and therefore control of the population's ability to feed itself and maintain its independence. Peoples that Rome wished to punish could be denied access to salt. Peoples that Rome wished to reward could be given preferential access to Roman salt at administered prices. The Roman state administered salt prices directly, keeping the cost of salt accessible to the urban poor as a matter of political stability, while the profits from the salt monopoly funded Roman public works. The same logic that Guanzhong had identified in 7th century China was operating in Republican Rome. Salt taxation was universal, unavoidable, and generated enormous revenue without the political costs of more visible forms of taxation. But salt did something else in the Roman world that extended its reach far beyond the tax ledger. Salt transformed the way Rome fed its armies, and the way Rome fed its armies determined how far Rome could project military power across the ancient world. A Roman legionary on campaign could not carry fresh meat across the distances Roman armies routinely covered. Fresh vegetables rotted. Fresh fish spoiled within hours in Mediterranean heat. What a Roman soldier could carry, what the entire logistical infrastructure of the Roman military was built around, was preserved food. Salted pork, salted fish, hardtack, dried legumes. The Roman army ran on salt-preserved protein. Its ability to sustain campaigns in Britain, in Syria, in North Africa, in Germany, across climates and distances that no other ancient military force had managed to conquer and hold, rested on the salt that kept its food edible across weeks and months of marching. This military dimension of salt's importance is the one that most people never think about, and that ancient and medieval military planners thought about constantly. Controlling an enemy's salt supply was a genuine military strategy, not a symbolic act but a practical one, because an army that could not preserve its food could not sustain a campaign. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with his elephants in 218 BCE and nearly destroyed Rome, lost a significant portion of his advantage when his supply lines lengthened, and his ability to obtain and distribute salt for food preservation became increasingly precarious. Historians who have analyzed the logistics of Hannibal's Italian campaign note that his inability to maintain adequate salt supplies for his troops was one of the practical constraints that prevented him from pressing his advantages after victories like Cannae. Medieval Europe inherited the Roman salt economy and elaborated it into one of the most complex and consequential trade systems of the pre-industrial world. The great salt-producing regions of Europe, the Bay of Burgneuf on the Atlantic coast of France, the salt mines of Salzburg in Austria, the salt pans of Sicily and Sardinia, the Baltic salt fisheries of Scandinavia, became the hubs of trade networks that connected the entire continent. The Hanseatic League, the commercial confederation of North German merchant cities that dominated Baltic trade from the 13th to the 17th century, was built in large part on the salt fish trade. Herring caught in the Baltic Sea needed to be salted before they could be transported south to the inland markets of Germany, Poland, and the Low Countries. The salt that preserved those herring came from the Bay of Burgneuf, carried north by Hanseatic ships. The control of that salt supply, the ability to buy it cheap, transport it efficiently, and sell it at a profit was the foundation of the Hanseatic commercial empire. When the herring moved from the Baltic to the North Sea in the 15th century, for reasons that marine biologists still debate, the Hanseatic League's economic dominance collapsed. The herring had moved. The salt trade had shifted. The entire political economy of Northern Europe reorganized around the new reality. The city of Venice built its entire commercial empire on salt. This is not a metaphor. The Venetian state, which would become the most sophisticated commercial republic in medieval Europe, and the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean for several centuries, began as a salt trading operation. Venice's lagoon environment made it ideal for solar salt evaporation. Seawater was trapped in shallow pans and allowed to evaporate, leaving salt crystals behind. The Venetians sold that salt to the mainland Italian cities in exchange for agricultural products they could not grow in their lagoon, and used the profits to build the ships that would carry the salt further and trade it for goods from across the Mediterranean world. The Venetian state took direct control of the salt trade in 1281, establishing a salt monopoly that required all Venetian merchants to purchase and carry a minimum quantity of salt on every trading voyage. This forced the salt into markets throughout the Mediterranean basin, gave Venetian merchants a guaranteed revenue stream that subsidized their ability to compete in other goods, and ensured that Venetian salt established itself as the standard product in ports from Alexandria to Lisbon. The salt monopoly was not merely a revenue source for Venice. It was the strategic infrastructure on which Venetian commercial dominance was constructed. Wars were fought over salt with a directness that seems almost impossible to modern sensibilities, accustomed as we are to a world where salt costs almost nothing and is available in unlimited quantities in every grocery store on Earth. The War of the Strozzi, fought in 15th century Italy, began as a conflict over control of salt production in the Po Valley. The French Wars of Religion in the 16th century were inflamed in part by the Gay Bell, the French salt tax, which was applied unevenly across different regions and created deep resentments that the religious conflict activated and amplified. The American Civil War has a salt dimension that is almost entirely absent from mainstream historical accounts. The Confederate South was desperately short of salt throughout the war, because its primary salt supply had been controlled by Union territory, and the shortage affected everything from the army's ability to preserve food to the civilian population's ability to maintain basic food security. The Union Army targeted Confederate salt works with deliberate strategic intent. Salt-making facilities in Virginia and along the Gulf Coast were destroyed by Union forces because the Union commanders understood, as military planners had understood since the Roman legions, that an army that could not preserve its food could not sustain a campaign. The attack on Confederate salt was not a peripheral action. It was a deliberate attempt to undermine the logistical foundations of the Confederate war effort. The gabelle, the French salt tax, deserves particular attention because it is one of the clearest examples in Western history of how salt taxation became an instrument of social control and class warfare. The gabelle was not a simple tax. It was a labyrinthine system of regional variations, exemptions, and obligations that had accumulated over centuries of French royal governance and had become, by the 18th century, one of the most hated and arbitrary impositions in the entire fiscal structure of the ancient regime. Different regions of France paid dramatically different prices for salt. Some areas paid many times what others paid for the same product, and some regions were subject to the obligation to purchase a minimum quantity of salt each year whether they needed it or not. This forced purchase requirement, the sel de devoir or obligatory salt, meant that French families in the heavily taxed regions were compelled to hand over a fixed sum to the crown annually for a mineral they might not need in the quantities they were forced to buy. The gabelle generated enormous revenue for the French crown and enormous resentment among the French population. Salt smuggling, the faux sonnage, was a massive industry in France as it had been in China, with smugglers carrying salt across regional tax boundaries in defiance of the laws that maintained the price differentials. The penalties for salt smuggling were savage: imprisonment, the galleys, death. Yet the trade persisted because the margins were irresistible, and the injustice of the tax system was so obvious that many ordinary French people who would never have considered themselves criminals saw nothing wrong with smuggling a product that should have been freely available. When the French Revolution came, the abolition of the gabelle was one of its earliest and most popular acts. The National Assembly abolished it in 1790, to widespread rejoicing. Napoleon reinstated it in 1806 to fund his wars. It was finally abolished permanently in 1945. The French salt tax had lasted with interruptions for over 500 years and had been one of the defining grievances of French political life for most of that period. The story of Africa's salt trade carries dimensions that the European narrative of salt taxation and commercial monopoly almost entirely omits. In the Western Sahara, in the great desert city of Timbuktu, and across the trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world, salt occupied a position in the economy that was even more extraordinary than it held in Europe and Asia. Salt from the Saharan mines of Tagheza and Tahdini, rock salt cut into great slabs by enslaved workers in conditions of almost unimaginable harshness, was traded pound for pound against gold from the mines of West Africa. Salt for gold, pound for pound. This exchange, which European traders who encountered it found incomprehensible until they understood the geography, was economically rational. West African gold-producing regions were far inland, in environments where the mineral was abundant. Salt was scarce inland in sub-Saharan Africa, where the ocean was distant and the geological conditions for salt deposit were rare. The people who had gold did not have salt. The people who had salt did not have gold. The exchange was mutually beneficial in a way that made both parties wealthy, and the trade routes that carried it, traversing some of the most hostile terrain on earth, maintained by Tuareg and Arab merchants across centuries, were among the longest continuously operating commercial routes in pre-industrial human history. The great medieval West African empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, were built on the revenues of this trade. The legendary wealth of Mansa Musa, the 14th-century emperor of Mali whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, reportedly depressed gold prices across the Mediterranean world for a decade by the sheer volume of gold he distributed along his route, rested ultimately on the salt-gold exchange that had made Mali the wealthiest state in the medieval world. The salt came from the desert. The gold came from the mines. The empire that controlled the trade route between them collected the revenue that built the mosques of Timbuktu and funded the scholars who made that city one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The British salt tax in India, which brought Gandhi to that beach in 1930, was in many respects a colonial extension of the same logic that had governed salt taxation everywhere from China to France for millennia. The British East India Company had controlled salt production in India from the late 18th century, and the colonial government maintained that monopoly throughout the period of direct crown rule. Indian salt, produced from the sea that surrounded the subcontinent on three sides, produced by an industry that had operated independently for thousands of years, was now legally the property of the crown. Indians were required to buy it at artificially inflated prices. The production of salt by individual Indians for their own consumption was a criminal offense. The scale of the imposition was staggering. Salt taxes accounted for a significant portion of British Indian revenue. The price of salt in India under British rule was roughly 3 times the cost of production, with the difference going directly to the colonial administration. In a country where the average agricultural laborer earned almost nothing, the salt tax represented a genuine and significant burden on the poorest members of society, people who needed salt to preserve food, to season their minimal diet, to survive the heat of the Indian climate, and who were paying a substantial portion of whatever small income they had to a foreign government for the right to do so. Gandhi understood that this was not merely an economic imposition. It was a demonstration of colonial power in its most fundamental form, the claim that the British government owned the mineral that Indian bodies required to survive. The salt tax was, in Gandhi's framing, the perfect embodiment of the entire colonial relationship, the reduction of a people to consumers of their own resources, stripped of the right to meet their own basic needs without paying tribute to a foreign power. The Salt March worked not because it was dramatic in the conventional sense, but because it was undeniable. The British could argue against Indian self-governance on complex administrative and political grounds. They could not argue with any credibility that Indians did not have the right to pick up salt from their own beaches. The simplicity of the act made the injustice of the law impossible to obscure. Gandhi had chosen his ground with perfect political instinct. The British response, arresting Gandhi and eventually imprisoning over 60,000 people for participating in salt civil disobedience, validated everything Gandhi had said about the nature of colonial rule. The image of the British Empire imprisoning tens of thousands of people for producing a mineral that cost nothing to extract and was freely available on every beach on the subcontinent made the empire's self-description, as a civilizing and beneficial institution, impossible to maintain with a straight face. The Salt March did not immediately end British rule. That would take another 17 years and a world war. But it changed the terms of the argument in ways that could not be reversed. The American journalist Webb Miller, who covered the march and the subsequent police crackdown on salt protesters, filed dispatches that were published across the United States and Europe. His account of Indian protesters walking forward in columns to be beaten by police, absorbing the blows without retaliating, falling and being dragged away and replaced by the next wave of marchers. This account reached audiences in Britain and America, and did more damage to the moral case for empire than any political argument could have managed. The beating of unarmed people for picking up salt was not a defensible image, and no amount of official justification could make it so. There is one dimension of salt's history that deserves its own careful attention, because it connects the ancient salt economy to one of the darkest chapters in modern history in ways that most people have never been asked to consider. The salt mines of sub-Saharan Africa and the Saharan interior were not staffed by willing workers. The Taghaza salt mines in the Western Sahara, the primary source for the salt-for gold trade that funded the great medieval West African empires, were worked by enslaved people, typically from sub-Saharan African communities, who were forced to live and work in conditions so extreme that Arab travelers who passed through described Taghaza as the most miserable place on earth. There was no wood for building, there were no crops for eating. There was nothing but salt. The ground was salt, the buildings were built from blocks of salt, the water was salt-contaminated, and the plea who extracted the salt had no choice about being there and no realistic prospect of leaving. The Arab historian Ibn Battuta visited Taghaza in 1352 and wrote about it in his famous travel account. He described enslaved workers cutting salt slabs in the heat, living in houses built from salt blocks with roofs of camel skin, eating food and drinking water brought in from hundreds of miles away, because nothing edible could survive in the salt-saturated environment of the mine. The workers who extracted the salt that funded the mosques of Timbuktu and the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa were among the most brutally exploited workers in the medieval world, and their exploitation was the hidden foundation of the commerce that contemporary observers celebrated as the wealth of the Western Sudan. This pattern, the brutal exploitation of enslaved or coerced labor at the point of salt production, hidden from the consumers and traders who benefited from that production, was not unique to the Sahara. The salt mines of Wieliczka in Poland, which operated continuously from the 13th century until 1996, relied at various points in their history on the labor of criminals sentenced to the mines, prisoners of war, and impoverished workers with no other options. The Roman salt works used enslaved labor. The salt evaporation ponds of the Caribbean in the colonial era used enslaved African labor, as did the salt production facilities of the American South. The salt that built civilization was, in many times and places, produced by people who had no share in the civilization it built. This is not a marginal footnote to the history of salt. It is a central dimension of that history, and ignoring it produces a story that is technically accurate in its economic and political analysis, but morally incomplete in ways that matter. Consider what it means that the word salary, which every working person in the modern world uses to describe their compensation, derives from the Latin salarium, rooted in the salt rations given to Roman soldiers. The workers who produced that salt often received nothing at all. The soldiers who received salt as wages were, by the standards of their time, well-compensated free men. The enslaved workers whose labor made the salt possible were writing a history that the language of compensation was not designed to remember. The ancient Egyptians had a different relationship with salt that complicates the simple narrative of salt as a tool of exploitation. Egyptian religious practice incorporated salt in ways that suggest a more complex cultural valuation than mere economic necessity. Salt was used in the mummification process, the preservation of the dead for the afterlife, and was therefore associated with transition between states of existence, with the boundary between the living and the dead. Natron, the naturally occurring salt compound found in the dry lake beds of the Egyptian desert, was the primary desiccating agent used in mummification. The body of a dead person was packed in natron for 70 days, the same period during which the star Sirius was invisible below the horizon, before being wrapped and placed in its tomb. The use of salt in mummification was not merely practical, it was ritual. The same substance that preserved fish and meat for transportation and consumption was used to preserve the bodies of the dead for their journey into the afterlife. Salt was the technology of preservation in both its literal and metaphysical senses, and Egyptian religious culture treated it accordingly. Salt appears in Egyptian magical texts as an ingredient in protective spells. It appears in ritual purification practices. It appears in the offerings made to the gods. The Egyptians were in this sense a society that had thought more carefully about salt than perhaps any other civilization in history, and what they had arrived at was the understanding that preservation itself, the resistance to decay, the maintenance of form against the entropy that dissolves all things, was a kind of sacred act. That insight echoes across human history in ways that are easy to miss because they are encoded in practices that seem, on the surface, merely practical. When a Jewish household salts meat to make it kosher, drawing out the blood before consumption, as required by Torah law, the use of salt carries within it thousands of years of accumulated meaning about purity, about the boundary between the acceptable and the forbidden, about the relationship between food and the sacred. When a Catholic priest blesses salt before incorporating it into baptismal water, the practice derives from a tradition that reaches back through medieval Christianity to Roman ritual practice to Egyptian religious use of natron. The mineral on your dinner table has been sacred, magical, political, commercial, criminal, and revolutionary, often simultaneously. The Industrial Revolution changed salt's place in human life more completely than any other single development in its history. The introduction of the solvay process in the 1860s, a chemical method for producing sodium carbonate from salt and limestone on a massive industrial scale, created a demand for salt as an industrial raw material that dwarfed its traditional uses in food preservation. The chloralkali process, which uses electrolysis to convert brine into chlorine and sodium hydroxide, made salt the feedstock for a vast range of chemical products, from the PVC that makes plastic pipes to the sodium hydroxide that bleaches paper pulp to the chlorine that disinfects drinking water. Today, roughly 70% of global salt production goes not into food but into industrial chemical processes. The salt mine is no longer primarily a food supply chain. It is a chemical feedstock operation, supplying the raw material for the plastics, papers, textiles, and treated water that industrial civilization runs on. The ancient connection between salt and the human body, the biological necessity that made it precious enough to fund empires and start wars, now accounts for less than one-third of why we produce it. And yet the body's need has not changed. The nervous system still requires sodium. The kidneys still depend on it. The muscles still need it to contract. The requirement that made salt the basis of the first great commercial civilizations is still there, running silently in every body on Earth, as non-negotiable as it was when the first Egyptian scribe recorded a recipe for salted fish on papyrus by the banks of the Nile. We have industrialized the supply, we have made it cheap, we have built entire chemical industries on top of the original necessity. But the necessity remains underneath all of that as fundamental as anything in biology. That is perhaps the most important thing the history of salt teaches. The things that the body truly requires, the non-negotiable biological necessities that cannot be substituted or circumvented, have a way of becoming the foundations on which everything else is built. Every empire needs revenue. Every revenue system seeks a tax that cannot be avoided. And a tax on something the body cannot live without is, by definition, the one tax that no one can refuse to pay. The empires understood this. The merchants understood this. Gandhi understood this, which is why he chose a beach and a handful of salt over every other act of defiance available to him. The crystal in your salt shaker is the same crystal that built Rome, funded Timbuktu, triggered the French Revolution, and ended the British Empire in India. It has been worth more than gold. It has been worth more than armies. It has been worth, at certain moments in history, more than almost anything else on Earth. And your body will not let you forget it for a single day.